Welcome back to our program. On the line with us is our old friend, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work.info, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. And you can tweet him at Prof. Wolff, P-R-O-F-W-O-L-F-F, or Democracy at Work. His other website is rdwolff.com. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
It is always marvelous to have you. So yesterday I went off on an extended rant about two articles that were on the front page of the Financial Times. The top article was headlined, the International Monetary Fund sounds alarm on excessive global borrowing with $164 trillion owed. And the other one was about how the banks in the United States are starting to expand their credit offerings to consumers. They're expanding their essentially subprime real estate and car loans. They're pushing credit cards really, really hard. We had a number of people who called up and talked about how they're getting more and more credit card solicitations. The banks are just creating an orgy of debt in the United States, and it seemed to me like these two stories were delivering very opposite messages. Your thoughts, and then I want to get into the UK Labour Party and their report on alternative models of ownership and how that might even relate to this. Your thoughts on the possibility that there's a debt bomb about to go off in our face?
Yeah, well, I think it's a very serious danger, a serious threat. We are examining, as we look at the debt levels, a situation that is frighteningly like what preceded the crash in 2008. And indeed, it is like crashes of the past, going back 200 or 300 years. It leads you to want to shake your head in disbelief that so little of history can be learned, that indeed we have to always go through it again, each time a bit more tragically than the time before. Let's look at this particular one. After the crash of, well, the two crashes in the new millennium, the one in 2000 itself, so-called dot-com crash, and then the even bigger one in 2008 and 9, that literally took down the world economy. After both of those, one of the strategies used to try to stabilize this horribly unstable system of capitalism was to drop interest rates, to pump money into the economy by really lowering interest rates to levels we have never seen before, barely above zero, and in a number of countries, including ours from time to time, actually even below zero to negative interest rates. Well, it doesn't take a genius to understand in the irrational, individualistic capitalism we live in, the business community particularly is going to take advantage of low interest rates to borrow in a way they wouldn't have dared to do before. Now, that was not the intent, but with the effort to stabilize capitalism by monetary policy, dropping interest rates so low, you basically invited the irrationality of this system to go crazy. And correspondingly, individuals started borrowing even though they got hurt in the 2008 crash. They started borrowing afterwards, and businesses have been on a borrowing binge now for a long time, even going so far as to borrow money for no other purpose than to increase the dividends they pay out to their shareholders, increase the pay packages for their top executives, and so on. Yeah. So yes, I'm afraid I have to say that this system's very mechanisms for coping with one kind of instability set up the terms and the conditions for the next kind of crash in an endless kind of attempt to manage this out-of-control system without questioning whether or not a different system might work better.
It seems like with debt, we go through a three-step cycle that is continuously repeating. We have an economy that is relatively stable where debt is in balance and at appropriate levels. Then we go into the speculative phase where everybody starts using debt to gamble on the value of their homes. This was the big deal in the 2006, 7, 8. Seminars being posted on every telephone pole, get rich quick and all this kind of stuff. Back in the 20s, it was buying stock with debt. And then the third phase is basically the Ponzi scheme phase, where people are using debt they go into debt, or companies in this case, like you just described, essentially just to siphon some of that debt off so they can stick it in their pocket, knowing that the whole thing is going to collapse, but they're trying to get their piece of it while it's still intact. And then when it does collapse, it restarts. Is that
Right.
accurate?
Absolutely, particularly that last point, if I could reinforce that, it's very, very important, that it is a kind of grab my piece and run away before the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. So you borrow like crazy, and you count either on having enough that you can weather the disaster, which of course the mass of people can't, or if you're really big, that you can go to the government and say, I'm so indebted that if you don't bail me out, I will default on all these debts and thereby take the whole economy down with me, which we saw all the major banks and the insurance companies basically, or many of them, do in 2008, 2009, and into 2010. It's just an amazing thing to have to read that in the hunt for profits, in the competition for more profits, banks are lending to riskier and riskier borrowers as if the history of the last 10 years had never happened.
So how would these alternative models of membership that the UK Labour Party has now endorsed, cooperatives, municipal and locally owned, locally led ownership, and national ownership, nationalization, how would they address this specific issue that we're talking about, or do they do that by a larger cleaning up, basically, of the excesses of unregulated capitalism?
A little bit of both. I think the idea is that you establish, and to get to the root of it, you establish that the decisions in economics are not going to be made anymore under the iron rule of capitalism, which is maximize profits. You don't survive in capitalism unless you maximize profits. There's no mechanism to allow you to do that. You're in a constant terror that your competitor, actual or potential, will come up with something that outmaneuvers you in one way or another, legal, illegal, it really doesn't matter once the competition gets going. What they're trying to do in England is basically say that there ought to be, at the very least, a major sector of our modern economies which doesn't run under that pressure, where other variables, like the quality of life at the workplace for the people who are there, the quality of the environmental impact, the quality of the kind of growth and the dispersion of the benefits of growth across the population, that these values are at least as important, if not more important, than the profitability that in the end accrues to the relatively small number of people that are owners of stocks in corporations, etc. And that the hope is, and the goal is, that a segment of the economy, a big one, that works like that, will allow us a kind of laboratory experiment to let the people of modern societies, Britain, the United States, wherever, to see how these differently run economic organizations work, to decide where we would prefer to spend our work lives in a democratically run, collective, machine-run, but democratic enterprise organization, or the kind of top-down hierarchy we're all used to, whether we want to buy products from the one kind of production system or the other, and in that way vote with our dollar purchases. Then we would have a society being able to look and experience at these alternatives to then decide whether it wants to go the one direction or the other, or indeed even mix the two together in a proportion that makes sense. Maybe you'd want to leave some things governed by the profit motive and other things clearly not. But in order to see that, you have to do what the British Labour Party is now considering, which is to make a governmental commitment, a social commitment. And the Labour Party has said that if Corbyn wins and becomes the new prime minister, they will do this. They will say to every firm, you can't go abroad, you can't sell out to another company. If you stay the way you are, you can stay the way you are. But if you propose a change, you have to do something first. You have to give your own workers what's called the right of first refusal. Those workers would have the right to buy the company at the going market price and convert it into a worker cooperative run democratically. And when the question is asked, well, how in the world would the workers ever get the money to be able to do that? Corbyn's answer is, that's where the government comes in. We will lend it to them because we're committed to having a worker co-op sector of our economy so that the people will finally see and be able to make an informed choice.
Now, in the United States, we're seeing some really good news with regard to democracy. For example, Maine, the people of Maine voted to have ranked choice voting, instant runoff voting. The Maine legislators tried to block it. Both Republicans and Democrats hate it because it breaks up the two-party monopoly. And the Maine Supreme Court just said, no, you've got to have this. So we're seeing, you know, lots of changes, small d democratically across the country, but not so much economically. How do we get this message into the mainstream thinking with regard to the economy?
Well, I've been working on it, as you know, for quite a while, and I am very happy to tell you that the interest in worker co-ops, the interest in converting work situations, bringing democracy to the workplace, to say it in the simplest way I know how, is more interesting to more people than ever in my lifetime in the United States right now. I think it's a reflection more than anything else of an awareness, especially since 2008 and 9, that the capitalist system, whatever else you think it may have achieved, is now dividing this country into a haves versus have-not situation that is frightening not just the people who don't have, but even the more sophisticated and reflective members of the core part of the population that does have, from Warren Buffett on down. And I think what you're seeing is a growing recognition that, yeah, we need to have a new and different way of doing our economic business. And here in New York, for example, we have the single largest worker co-op in the United States, Women in the Bronx, who have now 2,000 strong, operating a cleaning and growth business that has been extraordinarily successful and is run very carefully as a worker co-op.
That's great. Professor Richard Wolff, hang on just a second here.